I think Kevin just brought back what we hammered on yesterday about the need for cooperation. Whatever we need, whatever is done on a shared deal, really the baseline is cooperation. We'll move to the second presentation by Dr. Brent Boehlert. I'm crossing the Atlantic from Oxford to MIT. Brent, 10 minutes.
All right, thank you everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Is this on? Working? Yep, okay. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Salman. I will try to move quickly. I know you're very good at keeping time. Kevin has already gone over a lot of the preliminaries, so I won't cover those in detail about the GERD. Just to start things off, background and motivation. So, generally speaking, analytical work in the Nile Basin is focused primarily on engineering and infrastructure systems. So that's been, to a large extent, the focus of work. But very little has been done on the macroeconomic impacts of water allocation. And so that's one of the missing pieces, we feel, from work that's been done to date. And as a result, UNU-WIDER, the World Institute for Development Economics Research, funded some work to better understand the macroeconomic effects of land and water investment decisions in the Nile Basin. So very much in line with the topic of this workshop. In this particular case, we're taking this framework that we've built and applying it to a case study of the impact of filling the GERD on Egypt's economy. So specifically Egypt's economy. I'll talk about follow-on work later with Sudan and Ethiopia, but for now, this is focusing on Egypt. So don't need to get into this in any detail because this is the background here of what we're doing. But in terms of policies we assess, so there's some similarities to what Kevin did here. 4 rates of filling to the top of the conservation pool were considered. The first was unconstrained. This is a situation in which filling occurs as rapidly as is needed to be done by Ethiopia. In other words, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years. Just to be transparent about the assumptions that we make here, in this case, we're not considering multiple different GERD release scenarios. We're only considering one, and that's 30 billion cubic meters per year. And we're also only considering a starting elevation of the Hydropower Dam of 175 meters. So as we saw from the prior presentation, if we assume 165 meters, we have a very different picture than what you may see here. Okay, but those are important starting assumptions. So, as Kevin mentioned in the prior presentation, Nile flows over the filling period are uncertain in their stochastic process. So because of that, we need to take a risk-based approach. We used a slightly different approach than the one that he employed, something called KNN, which is a form of bootstrapping, so it's creating statistical hydrologies. We created 100 sequences of these for 20 years of future precipitation going forward. This is just a representation of that. For those of you who are familiar, we use as a water resources systems tool, something called MikeHydro, which is what the DSS is based on, built by THI. And another disclaimer here, key assumptions in this model were 14.5 billion cubic meters, so many different numbers are getting thrown around on that one, but also here 55.5 BCM for Egypt. Okay, and now the goal here was to bridge over from a water systems approach, which is what I was just presenting, over to an economy-wide modeling framework. And so there's something that UNU-WIDER, so the World Institute for Development Economics Research, developed that specifically tries to take some of these engineering systems approaches and link them into macroeconomic modeling tools. There's something called, for those of you who are familiar, a computable general equilibrium model. And so that's what this economy-wide model is formally. And the whole idea was to actually dynamically couple a water systems tool over to that economy-wide model. So where did we start? We started here with the MikeHydro model. You notice that I have cut things off right at the border of Egypt. Because in order to integrate the MikeHydro model with this CGE model, the economy-wide model, which is built in a program called GAMS, which is the Generalized Algebraic Modeling System, we had to build a different version of the IS-1 dam model. And so this representation here, we have the Tashka Depression, we have the different reservoirs in the Cascade, and then we have the M&I and the irrigation demands downstream represented. And this is a programming model built independently of MikeHydro. It's taking inputs as flows into the Hydropower Dam, and then from there we're coupling it with a shell directly over to an Egypt economy-wide model. So there's two separate models, and then there's a third model, which is the outer box, that brings these two models together and allows them to communicate. That's what this is here. So the high Aswan Dam model is taking hydropower production and crop mix and feeding it over into the economy, because those are what are driving the economic outcomes. And then the economy-wide model is taking prices from hydropower and crops and feeding them back in, and that's what drives the economic optimization in this model, and the model proceeds. So we're actually incorporating physical effects dynamically into an economy-wide framework. The outcomes in terms of what are we looking at when we talk about macroeconomic metrics, gross domestic product, employment, value added, a whole range of different things that many governments are very interested in because of the fact that these are the language in which they communicate, which is one of the reasons why WIDER was interested in this approach. So just sort of a very straightforward subset of some of the results. So what we're seeing here is that unconstrained, and this is just looking at things from the water resources perspective, unconstrained GERD filling causes about 6% reduction on average in high Aswan Dam hydropower generation. And in the 5th percentile, so this is the, sort of a 1 in 20 event in terms of bad hydrology for the system, 12% reduction in hydropower output. But what's very interesting about this is that when we actually translate this over to GDP effect, the impact gets diluted about 100-fold. Just in terms of relative change, right? This is the percentage effect on the Egyptian economy. And so the operative thing here to look at is, we're going from about 12% to 0.12%, 6% down to about 0.04%. Now, when we translate these into absolute terms, this is actually a bigger impact. This is a larger dollar number because the Egyptian GDP is about $280 billion per year. Okay? So it's a very large number. However, in terms of its relative impact on the economy, it's fairly muted. Okay, but there is an important note here. One of the things that this model allows us to do is look across different income classes and across sectors. And in this case, the 5th percentile agricultural GDP loss is 0.3%, which is about 2.5 times higher than the impact on the economy as a whole. So why is this happening? First, because economies are elastic. So substitution occurs, and that's reflected in the novel outcomes. Another thing is that Egypt's economy has fundamentally changed since Aswan was constructed in 1970. Right? We went from 63% dependence on hydropower for electricity to 9. We went from 30% agriculture GDP down to only 11. These are figures from the World Bank. Okay, now let's look at the trade-off and compare it over to Ethiopia. So the question here is, how much is Ethiopia affected by a slower fill policy? So when we move from a no policy, this is an unconstrained scenario out to 10 years, you can see that the overall level of production changes quite a lot. So there are risks imposed by moving to a slower fill policy. In this case, if we take into account 10 cents per kilowatt hour roughly, that gives us an annual revenue of about $1.2 billion, fairly significant amount. Now, going back to the comparison between these two, Ethiopia and Egypt, ideally we would actually have an economy-wide model of Ethiopia. We don't, in this case, that's yet to come. So instead, for now, we're simply just multiplying 10 cents per kilowatt hour by the changes in generation. What we see in terms of Egypt's GDP losses, these range from 350 billion or 117 billion to 350 million per year, and Ethiopian GDP gains are quite a bit higher. So there is room for cooperation. So what are the conclusions of this work? First off, there is a very big dilution, sort of a muting of the effect when we look at GDP impacts of GERD filling. Now again, it's important to emphasize that this assumes a 30 BCM GERD release and a 175 meters starting elevation there are distributional issues. Losses to agriculture and lower income categories tend to be the highest, right, which are the most at-risk populations. Longer fill periods pose risks to Ethiopia, and generally speaking, the losses to Egypt tend to be lower than the gains to Ethiopia. I don't think that's a big surprise from what we've heard so far. So next steps in this work. First step is to evaluate multiple starting elevations. I think we can agree that's an important step. Another is to actually link economy-wide models for Ethiopia and Sudan into one regional network to evaluate cooperative solutions from a macroeconomic perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brent. We'll cross Atlantic back, and it's actually Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And the third speaker is Dr. Yasser Mohammed, and he'll talk about the transboundary management of the reservoir system in the Eastern Nile region, implications to downstream riparians. Yasser, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.